Hello, wanted to make another quick little video for all who feel inclined to check it out. This one's going to have to do with food. Um, I know most of the stuff I'm talking about has to do with climate and other social things, but food, I believe, is a food and access to it is a strong indicator of the direction a society is going. Um, and over time, especially since COVID, we've been observing a pretty negative trend here in this nation, and feel inclined to talk about it, especially for people who have kids or want to have kids. It's really important to look at the direction that things are going, and grapple with that reality that you know the institutions that we have are outright failing us, and we need to do more than vote. Um, so the first thing I wanted to hop in and check out is actually an update from me myself. I had a little bit of citizens journalism. I was fortunate enough to speak with Michael Berger of the Tri Area Ministry Food Pantry, and how some recent cuts to federal USDA programs have impacted people here in my community. If you feel inclined, you can check out Triangle Free Press and read the whole thing. What I wanted to talk about is, talking about the trend over here. I asked Michael a quick question to wrap up our interview. Um, it was a question that Nate Hagans often asked his guests on his podcast, and I just thought it would be neat to hear what he had to say about it. And I was asking him essentially if everything could be, perfectly how he envisioned, what would he want to do besides just restoring the USDA programs. Um, and his response kind of struck me. It says, well, our goal as a food pantry is obsolescence. We would rather not have a reason to be here. If everybody had plenty of food, then there's no reason for us. We've been here since 1988, and yet we serve more families now than ever before, so the problem is still growing. The true solution to food insecurity is jobs and housing. If people have affordable housing and employment and a wage that they can live on, they don't need food from the food pantry. Those are issues which are far greater than I or our food pantry can address. But if you wanted to look at the big picture and what solves food insecurity, what solves it is for people to be able to support themselves so they don't have to decide, do I pay the rent or do I buy food? Um, and that's his like big picture answer. Um, and looking at statistics, here in North Carolina, 1 in 5 children face hunger, and 1 in 7 people. Um, we need a literal $1 billion of investment annually to be able to meet these needs. Um, you know, and we can break down over here, I believe. You can look. I was asking ChatGPT to kind of break down the cost of I meant to do a rate of change calculation, but oh well. But you can kind of see here the food CPI has basically doubled since 2000. Well, you know, around the time we were born, and the paycheck to paycheck instance has increased quite dramatically as well. So, these two trends together is not ideal, right? So that's just here in our nation. And then I also wanted to talk about, naturally what's going on in Gaza still, and the egregious kind of affronts to just regular working people there. and kind of how that, the here at home and abroad kind of intersect. You know, uh, routinely, when the UN votes to make food a human right, uh, the only two nations that say no are the United States and Israel. Um, and there's plenty of other interesting things that they vote together on. For example, this this headline was something: West votes against democracy, human rights, cultural diversity at UN, promotes mercenaries and sanctions. Quite a legacy. Um, yeah, this map here is just a vote for respecting human rights and cultural dignity. Now, the UN has a Declaration of Human Rights. I don't know if y'all have ever checked that out, but it's pretty interesting considering the deficits that this country has in regard to this declaration and the conditions they subject people to, again, with our domestic and foreign policy. Um, but this one in particular I wanted to talk about. It says everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. So, if you pay attention to history, it's not really anything new that the United States is violating international laws or, whatever. Um, but I just feel like it's particularly striking that this is, here, and yet in our own country, we're abandoning our neighbors and subjecting them to these conditions that are genuinely quite harmful and violent. Not, with regard to food, of course, but also healthcare, shelter, the basic necessities. um, and I'll talk about that more in a bit. This post here I wanted to share that kind of goes into that kind of sentiment. Um, but especially egregious with regard to Gaza and what's been going on there. It's, to see the, obviously we can't even see the full extent, but to see what has been going on there is quite striking. And again, like, we don't have the option to vote about that kind of stuff. Pretty much the status quo is pretty much insistent on genocide. So when that is the only direction for this, institution that we all participate in and essentially pay for with our taxes, that's, I believe we have the responsibility to really look at that and analyze ways that we can materially challenge it, because they won't let us vote that away. There's that quote: "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." It rings true in that regard. Like, if they're fine starving children and allowing them to, be murdered in, calculated, violent ways, they could care less about letting us vote about issues. This is some stuff that we as citizens in the global north have a responsibility to, equip ourselves with an A to Z understanding of the matter, both of like why it's happening, what is happening, and then what we can do to address it, because business as usual, if it continues, is guaranteed more genocide. Again, not just in Gaza also, but like the entire global south, right, is subject to these policy choices that is, they're incredibly violent. They encourage starvation among children. needless suffering that's quite extreme. And my point with talking about, and connecting these things is that, going back to this article, the food insecurity is growing here in the, core of these problems. So there's all this violence and war and destruction to our environment. And the ultimate end of it is not even that people in this nation are well off. There's 60 or more percent living paycheck to paycheck. There's mounting food insecurity. It's like, what is this all for? What is the trajectory? We have a responsibility, because we're alive right now, to and here and participating in the society, to analyze kind of, like I was saying, the A to Z understanding about what can be done. Going back to Gaza, I wanted to play this video real quick because I just found it quite significant. Oops.
Locked it in a warehouse. What do you think Martin Luther King Jr. would say about a nation that purchased food for starving kids and then locked it in a warehouse until it expired and incinerated it, rather than giving it out so that 27,000 starving kids could survive meagerly? Nearly 500 tons of high-energy biscuits stored at a USAID warehouse in Dubai are due to expire in July, according to a former USAID official. The biscuits could feed at least 27,000 acutely malnourished children for a month. The biscuits are now likely to be destroyed or turned into animal feed. That article was from 2 months ago. Yesterday, The Atlantic reported that the expiration date on those 500 tons of nutritious food for starving kids was now upon us, and the U.S. had decided to incinerate that food rather than allow starving children to have it. Mr. Egas, you're the Deputy Secretary for Management and Resources. These are resources that were purchased with U.S. taxpayer dollars. They're specifically designed to save the lives of starving children. Why is it a good use of resources to not distribute that food to kids and instead burn it?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I'd have to look into that particular issue and see how those foodstuffs got there.
Can I just interrupt for a second? I asked this question at a hearing yesterday, so you would be prepared to know that I would ask it today. And we called your office to tell you that I would ask it today. So the notion that you need to look into it strikes me as a little bit odd. I view it as an intentional thing, because if we suddenly woke up in July, oh gosh, the expiration date is today. That would be one thing. But in March, there was a request by the World Food Program and others. Look, if you're not going to distribute it, maybe you've decided, the U.S., that starving kids are no longer your thing. But you have this asset. If you're not going to distribute it, we'll distribute it. So it's not a mistake if you've been on notice of it for 2 months and you've made the decision to keep the warehouse locked. Hey, you went to Boston University. Who is the most famous BU alum?
The most famous BU alum?
Next to you.
I don't know. I don't want to offend anyone that's graduated from BU. But
I'll tell you who it is.
Okay.
Martin Luther King Jr. What do you think Martin Luther King Jr. would say about a nation that purchased food for starving kids and then locked it in a warehouse until it expired and incinerated it, rather than giving it out so that 27,000 starving kids could survive meagerly for 1 more month?
Well, we're still the biggest giver of aid anywhere in the world by far. So I think, look,
I'll just conclude. I want to hand it back to you, Mr. Chair. A lot of complicated issues. Sometimes the tiniest detail really exposes the soul. What do you think?
And so it's like, what are we doing? It just makes me think about, how, again, domestically, we're throwing away food to protect profit margins. This is all policy choice. Nothing has to be the way that it is. It is being chosen actively, right? Every day is a new opportunity for us to challenge this status quo materially and not have these kind of things happen. That, there's, additionally, incinerating stuff on principle is not great for the climate, but there's also the waste of it. These things were produced, they were packaged, they were shipped, and then thrown out. Same thing with our, the way we handle food here. Uh, just stuff to think about. So again, going back to this, talking about acute hunger, I believe this one is global. Yeah, if we look at the global trend, not good. Not a great direction. So, yep. This thing, I guess I'll talk about last. It's just a chart that's kind of unrelated, but I wanted to share. This is that post I was talking about that kind of connects Gaza and stuff in the U.S. It's just a really cool little post, so I just wanted to, cover it, I guess. So she's talking about how a lot of people feel devastated because it's easier to empathize. And also, before I go into this, I didn't want to say, like, I'm not trying to make anyone feel guilty or bad about how they've been interacting with this stuff, because, it's a lot. And my intention with talking about it is encouraging action over everything else. That's why I want to bring this to people's attention, because the ruling class, and people with consolidated wealth are really doubling down with advances in AI. Just we've seen what's been going on with ICE. They've been really doubling down on consolidating the every bit of power they can, and again, they're just getting more and more rich over time. Actually, that would be a great time to talk about this chart, about how it overlays the instance of union membership along with the income share of the top 1%, which is up here, and that's down here, and the top 10%, which is up here. And then over on the left, it compares the productivity index, compensation index, and the cost of living index. So we see cost of living goes crazy. Compensation, not exactly proportional. Productivity is still going up more than compensation, all while union membership is nosediving. And things are better than ever for the rich. So if we take this trajectory and apply it to our future, as food insecurity increases, but the richest among us are consolidating more and more power and money and access to decision-making capability, what does that mean for the working class as we're moving forward, right? Like again, we have to care about our futures here. We can't just check out, especially those of us with kids or want to have kids. It's really important stuff to be navigating this intentionally and in ways that are deeper and more significant than just relying on voting, which has proven over and over to be inadequate for actually materially addressing the needs of regular working people, as we will see later on when we go through this tab. But the big example I always love to quote is the Great Depression, right? Like, that wasn't solved by altruism from the government. It wasn't solved by voting. It was solved by organizing. It was solved by materially challenging the status quo that produced the Depression in the first place and demanding concessions, which is what we desperately need. And now we have a government that is not too keen on meeting any of our needs, right? It doesn't care if we live or die. Our neighbors are homeless without health care, without adequate food now, and there's only more and more and more of those instances as time is going on. So, you know, it seems like the status quo encourages us to just keep our heads down, to focus on, entertainment or whatever, and just accept that this is the reality of the situation. For example, I speak with my parents and they just say, well, there's always going to be, rich and poor people and this kind of class relationship, but it's only, it can be addressed, right? Legally, materially. There's avenues, and we can look to history for those, and we'll talk about that more. Anyway, so going back to this post. So yeah, they say it's easier to empathize with people that you do not have to be accountable for, and that you believe you can do little support. Too many people are participating in emotional martyrdom as a means to seek validation and avoid actual movement labor. We are, and the tweet goes, or I guess the thread goes, we are watching the forced starvation of Gazans because too many people in U.S. communities are willing to accept food apartheid as a norm here at home. What we accept as beneficiaries of the empire will always stand as an acceleration point for the empire's next victims. I just thought that went hard, like exactly right. The United States has only been able to purvey the level of violence that they have over these years, like decades, a long time, because of what we have been, I guess, what we have accepted as normal, because those with consolidated wealth have pretty much controlled the conversation, right? They control the media, they control the education system relatively, they control pretty much like all of that. So again, like going back to what I was saying, like people just accept, oh, there's rich and poor, oh, there's going to be homeless, there's going to be, it's they don't see it as a policy choice, which is what it is. They see it as almost like an inevitability, and that's just part of society, and that this is the best society, and that they can't be a better one. Which I think is a pretty ridiculous concept, considering we are watching our tax dollars pay for starving babies and starving neighbors and neighbors without health care or shelter, or the entire, continent, the entire continent's being destabilized, like with regard to Africa. South America, we have decades of meddling, right? And needless suffering, and it's not ideal. Anyway, they say, remember this, as some of you still argue that children shouldn't have access to free lunches. Your apathy toward the care of your neighbors is if affirmation of the state's systematic depravity. I don't know how you say that word. Devastation is hollow and little more than lip service if it isn't aligned with a political praxis that seeks to actively disrupt the weaponization of food systems and access to basic needs. You cannot say you're devastated by the targeting of Palestinian people and their forced starvation while ignoring 1 in 7 Americans in the U.S. deal with severe food insecurity because of the active neglect and targeting of certain communities. Again, nail on the head. Like, exactly right. We see these things, we experience emotional turmoil from them, but when it comes to actually organizing in a material fashion, it's just like, I don't know. So I just wanted to encourage that. That's like the logical next step. We cannot just allow the ruling class to continue getting away with these crimes, because unchallenged, of course they're going to keep doing it. That's great for the profit margins. Again, this has been working for them. They love this. They love seeing what's happening in Palestine. They love seeing what's happening to our neighbors because they know that means the system that made them rich and put them in the position they're in class society is not being challenged, right? It's working exactly how they want it to. We'll continue with that, with this tab. We'll keep going though, which brings me to my next point. Far too many of you are solely centering Palestine in discussions of forced famine while simultaneously ignoring both the Congo and Sudan. Sudan has been in a state severe famine that Palestinians have now reached for months. And I'm guessing it meant to say state of severe famine. And I am not saying this so that we construct oppression Olympics, but to remind everyone that our lack of capacity, anti-blackness, and political incompetence are never inconsequential, but compounding oppressive factors that yield material consequences. Again, nail on the head. We cannot, like, there's a luxury and privilege in looking at politics as if it's something we can opt out of, just like environmentalism, right? To look at that and say, oh, well, somebody else can worry about it. It's like we are here now. We have a responsibility. We're active participants in this, and we have a choice to either encourage something new or encourage this status quo. And what that means for all of our futures, not to mention those in the global south and those in Gaza today and all the other places that are under the boot of imperialism. Goes on to say, honestly, I am not going to say this nicely because some of y'all need to hear it directly. What do your feelings of devastation mean while people die en masse? What is the value of your empathy if it never materializes any changes? Feelings are not labor, to be completely honest. No matter how devastated you are, your devastation is not an expression of resistance or change if it is divorced from supportive action. There is no way, unless you have experienced forced starvation at this level, which most of us have not, that we could even begin to emotionally empathize with the victims of genocide. Many people in the US are still struggling to cognitively empathize with the implications of genocide. What many of you are displaying is called empathetic distress and concern. I'm not saying you should divorce these feelings, but simply that they should not be prioritized when thinking of the labor needed to change people's circumstances. So, I mean, yeah. And this is why folks really need to do the internal labor as well, because discernment about where you should be spending your capacity is necessary for sustainability. This sentence, as far as our generation goes, and the younger generations as well, I think that's like the most important thing we can talk about with regard to the climate and our trajectory as a class of regular working people. Because like we're under attack all the time. We have these companies that have spent decades and tons of money and resources on research and development to design things to be addictive as possible. TV, apps, games, whatever, or even the technology itself. They've spent all this money to take away our ability to have discernment about where we should be spending our capacity. This society has gotten to a point where it has engineered basically the opposite of this if you don't make an an intentional effort to challenge that. Yeah, and it is internal labor. And that's the thing. So many of us are so busy. We got stuff to do. so many are paycheck to paycheck. That there's not an incentive for internal labor and discernment. It's quite the opposite, actually. We want to chase those cheaper kind of ways to regulate ourselves that coincidentally the ruling class and those with consolidated wealth provide, right? They want us to depend on them. Which, that reminds me, I saw something recently about that, and I wish that I had opened it up, but oh well. Um, but yeah, being cognizant about the ways they want us to depend on their status quo and what that means, again, for our own futures, for the futures of everyone we care about, our friends and families and neighbors, our neighbors at home and abroad, right? The global south as a whole, the places that are really under the boot. There's all these things have to be considerations as we're moving through our day. To not consider them is, essentially to give the ruling class a free pass to continue this crap, right? It's to sign up for starving babies and eventually a future that is going to be very difficult, even here in our own country. Anyway, it goes on to say, emotions are information, not directives. You feel devastated, and what are you going to do with it? Goes on to talk about famines. Famine is a man-made, systematic, and military-aided violence. It is also a heavily predictable and long-used tool of colonization. For famine to occur, both food apartheid and a history of food system dispossession must occur. We are watching the beginnings of this in our own country through the dissolution of food programs, defunding of farm programs, and food safety regulations. Right? So that's kind of full circle what I was talking about at the start. Man, I really wish I had pulled up that thing talking about the reliance on their status quo thing. But anyway, I think the point still comes across. So anyway, I was thinking about all this stuff, wanting to make a video already. Then I pulled this thing up. It's Claude 4. I just like asking the AI stuff like this. I know I'm always preaching about climate, but I just like to kind of, ask it things. So I just asked it, what are the, because I'm curious what it would say, because I love how it's unbiased. That's the thing with trying to get to the root of global systemic problems, is a lot of times what shapes the answer there is, who is answering the question. And oftentimes, here in the West, we're finding Western resources. So it's hard to find like an unbiased kind of thing in that regard. So that's why I like these AI things, because they take all of information pretty much and kind of spit out something relatively unbiased from what I can tell. It's definitely interesting to check out. But anyway, the rest of this is just going to be me going through this long conversation. I just feel inclined to share it. So, but yeah, so I just asked it, what are the biggest drivers of global food insecurity? Biggest drivers are interconnected, often reinforce each other: conflict and violence, wars, civil unrest, disrupt food production, distribution, and markets. Population displacement breaks agricultural cycles. Again, we see that clear as day. Our taxes are paying for it in Gaza. Plenty of other places, Sudan. The West has a role in that. Pretty much, all of everywhere there was colonization, that was happening. Even in the UK, right? All the way back to like the very inception of these kind of systems. People were being torn away from the land and displaced and stuff. Anyway, yeah, they just say that accounts for a significant portion of acute hunger globally. And see, that's another thing. We talk about voting. Have we ever been able to vote for these conflicts, for our tax dollars to go to destabilizing nations just because rich people want that to happen? Anyway, climate change, that one's kind of self-explanatory. I've spoken about that quite a bit. Economic factors. Poverty limits access to food, despite it being available. Income inequality creates disparities in food access. Economic shocks and inflation make food unaffordable. We've been living through that. Limited access to credit and markets for smallholder farmers. Political instability. Weak institutions fail to ensure food distribution. Corruption diverts resources from food programs. Poor policy decisions affect agricultural investment. Limited social safety nets. This is a lot to unpack, and I ask it some stuff about that later. Infrastructure deficits. Inadequate transportation networks prevent food distribution. Poor storage facilities. Limited access to clean water and sanitation. Insufficient rural infrastructure. Again, these are policy choices. Market and trade issues. Food price I can't say that word. I'm so sorry. Volatility affects accessibility. Trade restrictions and export bans, market concentration and speculation, supply chain disruptions. They should add sanctions in there too. Yeah. So I asked it, could it be argued that the current hegemonic status quo dominated by the West is largely what results in these things? So it kind of pulled a both sides kind of thing. It was talking about supporting the view the colonial systems disrupted traditional food systems and land tenure. Extraction-based economies left many countries dependent on cash crops rather than food security. Again, you see that in my own community. All that tobacco. Artificial borders created states without considering agricultural ecological boundaries. Trade agreements and WTO rules may favor industrialized agriculture over smallholder farming. Debt structures and structural adjustment programs sometimes prioritize export crops over local food production. A lot of that with the global south. Again, policy choices. Agricultural subsidies in wealthy countries can undercut farmers in developing nations. And then there's climate stuff. Industrialized nations contributed disproportionately to climate change, while the global south bears much of the impact. Again, the definition of injustice. That's like the reason to act on climate and really hold our ruling class accountable. Because, like, is that not a crime? Like, we're making these people suffer. Well, the ruling class is making these people suffer because they wanted to get rich. And, climate change was an externality. And it's just too bad. You should have been born somewhere else. That's their policy. It's disgusting. Environmental costs of industrial agriculture exported to poorer regions. Yeah. Then it also goes on to say, as a counter perspective, that a lot of these food security issues stem from domestic governance, corruption, and conflict. Some countries have still achieved it despite global power structures and technology transfers and development aid from wealthy countries. They also just say it's complicated, essentially. And they highlight that local agency and decision making remain crucial. So it both sides it. So then I was saying, okay, so if we consider root cause analysis, how could it be argued that these consequences are anything but outcomes stemming from policy choices from the dominant status quo? And then it kind of is like, okay, let's break it down then. So the Bretton Woods institutions, again, it goes back decades. World Bank, IMF structured global finance according to wealthy nations' priorities. Right there is all you, that's it in a nutshell. That's all of our problems. WTO rules prioritize corporate agriculture and intellectual property over food sovereignty. UN Security Council structure gives permanent veto power to former colonial powers, Yeah, what the hell. Debt mechanisms that force export-oriented agriculture over food crops. Patent systems that prevent seed saving in traditional farming. Again, this is colonialism in practice still now. Trade rules that dump subsidized agricultural products, undercutting local farmers. Land grabbing facilitated by international investment agreements. see that in my community. Water and mineral rights structured to benefit foreign corporations. Carbon markets that can displace local communities. That's a real, something to explore. That, talk about the A to Z thing. Anyway, and now it's talking about like the internal factors as outputs of systemic engineering by the West. So related to governance failures, weak states often result from colonial administrative structures designed for extraction, not development. Corruption frequently involves Western corporations and financial systems. Political instability can stem from externally imposed structural adjustment. So yeah, colonialism still. Again, crimes. This should be viewed as crimes against humanity, right? Like agricultural systems, monocultural cash crops were colonial impositions maintained through market incentives. That's another thing. Policy choice right there. Incentives. Incentives is what drives human behavior. There's no human nature. There's no whatever. There's incentives that drive behaviors and outcomes. So if we shape the incentives with policy, we get different outcomes. That's a big thing because, right now our current outcomes from the incentives we have are starving babies, neighbors without access to basic necessities, like what is the point? And 10% of the population being wealthy beyond obscenity. Great system. And it's nosediving into a unlivable biosphere. Like, what is the point of keeping it around? What is the point of not organizing and demanding something better? There's no reason, right? We need to get on the same page about this stuff as a class of regular working people, but especially as young people. Anyway, loss of agricultural biodiversity follows from industrial agriculture models exported globally. Biodiversity loss is serious with regard to climate. Biodiversity helps sequester carbon. It's genuinely good just to have it. Anyway, farmer debt crises result from input-dependent systems promoted by agribusiness. Yeah. Farmer debt crises is just a thing in itself to explore. And then conflict. Resource competition is intensified by extractive economic models. Ethnic tensions often traced to colonial boundary drawing and divide and rule strategies. Where have we heard that? Yeah. So then I go on to say, in the United States, food insecurity is also on the rise, despite the nation being responsible for contributing to and sometimes outright engineering the conditions above. Can you explain why this is the case, despite setting up all these extractive administrative structures across the globe? Asking the real questions. So, it comes out swinging. This contradiction reveals something crucial about how these systems actually function. They're not designed to benefit entire nations, but rather specific class interests that transcend borders. Again, going back to World War II, after the Great Depression, there's a great book called The Making of an Atlantic Ruling Class, and it's, essentially describes how this phenomenon led to the rise of the Nazis in the first place. And again, these incentives, because of this class structure that came from colonialism, which came from feudalism, which yada yada, the incentives drive this outcome. And again, we are on board. We are on this as like we're here. We're alive during this time. We can act and undermine it and demand something better and build something better, or that's going to be our future, right? Talking about, and it is our future, right? It's already, genocides are happening, have been happening, right? Decades of this, all over the world, all over the global south. Like, this stuff has been going on. This is just the most recent, most egregious example that we can look at, like Gaza and Sudan and everything. But yeah, anyway, I'll get off my soapbox and let's lock back in. So it goes on to say the same logic applied domestically. Financialization over function. Food systems optimized for profit extraction, not food security. Again, does that not damn the entire system right there? What the hell? Especially during we have a crisis essentially in, with the topsoil, with the nutritional content of food, the climate. We're prioritizing profit, dead money that we can't do anything with, versus, well, we can't do anything with if the biosphere collapses, versus like actual security for ourselves and our neighbors. Agricultural land treated as financial asset / speculation vehicle. Food corporations prioritize shareholder returns over affordability. Again, this can be scaled to so many things, and again is a root cause of so many problems. It's a policy choice. Labor exploitation. Same low-wage models used globally applied to domestic food and agriculture workers. Gig economy creates food service workers who can't afford the food they serve. Union busting creates precarious employment even in food production. And then austerity and public disinvestment. Social safety nets systematically weakened. Same IMF austerity logic applied domestically. Again, huge, extremely important when we're talking about the trajectory of this country and our futures and the futures of everyone we love and care about and all that. Like, when austerity is not a good thing for regular working people. We saw it after 2008. We saw what it did, and they're doubling down on it again. It's literally baffling to see these practices being doubled down on when we know it's going to harm us as a class. It's going to harm our neighbors. It's going to harm people all over the world. And the ruling class are choosing it because, again, they love it. They don't even consider us as like any impact, any fallout, any consequences. We might as well not even be human beings to these people who are in executive decision-making roles. Voting is not going to fix that. We have to really challenge that stuff if we want an end to it. And we should, because look at what it's causing, right? It's starving babies. It's people going without needlessly, needless suffering. Think about some of the greatest inventions and contributions to mankind has been just random kind of people having their needs met and being able to contribute in the special way that they can. This kind of policy takes away from the entire human race because of that, right? When people don't have their needs met, they're focusing on surviving, not on contributing and making the world better. Like, we are all losing out. Not to mention that suffering is bad and morally reprehensible. Not to mention that violence and murder and, causing children to starve and get shot is, should be a spot where we stop and think about just all of it, Anyway, continuing onward, school meal programs, SNAP, WIC face constant cuts. Public health infrastructure deliberately underfunded. Capital knows no borders is the next section. Wealth concentration. Global extraction enriches a transnational capitalist class, not Americans, broadly. Same families, corporations, benefiting from land grabs abroad own vast U.S. agricultural assets. Profits flow upward, regardless of nationality. System contradictions. What's profitable, processed foods, land speculation, labor exploitation, often undermines what's needed, accessible, nutritious food. Again, when we read stuff like this, it's like, what are we doing? Export-oriented agriculture can create domestic food deserts. Financialized food markets create there's that word again, that hurts domestic consumers too. Amazing. The same interests that shape global trade policy also I just wanted to say this is a lot of gloom and doom. I promise there are productive things coming and reasons to be hopeful and optimistic, because this stuff, like, it could be easy to address if we organized. There are material solutions we can learn from history where countries and nations and people were able to address these very things with a lot less resources and a lot more difficult circumstances. It's just a matter of configuring our organizing to fight this stuff. Anyway, back to it. Political capture. The same interests that shape global trade policy also capture domestic food policy. Regulatory agencies are staffed by industry insiders. Campaign finance ensures policy serves capital, not constituents. Again, all this stuff, we've seen it for decades. We've seen it our whole lives. We've seen how the landscape has already shifted since 2008, since COVID. You know, how these bastards keep doubling down on this kind of shit. You know, they're gonna keep doing it. They're gonna keep taking, unless we put our foot down. They're laughing at us, expecting voting to be sufficient. Anyway, the US population becomes, in effect, another territory to be extracted from, just with different methods than direct colonialism. The system's logic is consistent. Maximize capital accumulation regardless of human need. Right there, you know how I was making the parallels to the Nazis and to fascism. That is it. Fascism is colonialism turned inward is a great quote. I forget who says it. I am sorry. But that's the thing. Like, the global south has been, you know, ran through, for lack of better terms. Capital is hungry. They continue to demand more and more and more. It's going to turn inward eventually. And we're living through that. And it's a sorry state. It's unfortunate that that's the reality that we're in. But we can't keep pretending this is normal. And we can't keep pretending there's a, you know, this is acceptable, right? Like, we have to do something about it, right? We're alive now. We have the capability to do it. Why would we want that to continue? Why would we want babies to continue starving? Why would we want our neighbors to continue not being able to have health care? Or have to sleep on the street, you know? Or have to die early because of poverty, you know? Like I was saying in that other video, like the deaths of despair. Why is that a thing? What is the point? Who's benefiting from that? Because it's not our class. It's only 10% of people that we'll never meet, that don't live in our communities, right? Anyway, I go on to ask it. Also, man, this is long. I'm sorry. Regarding the particular point of what's profitable often undermines what's needed, the trend has not been very great over the past few decades and has been exacerbated even more after the economic consequences of COVID. Does this trend illustrate that our current mode of organizing society is just a race to the bottom for regular working people in the US? See, and I just want to see what it says. I'm just curious. And it says, yes, the evidence strongly suggests that this is exactly what's happening, and COVID served as an accelerant that made these underlying dynamics impossible to ignore. The acceleration since COVID. Corporate consolidation. Food giants saw record profits while families face food insecurity. Small restaurants, food businesses eliminated while chains expanded market share. Agricultural land increasingly consolidated by investment firms during economic distress. Then we have labor degradation. Essential workers in food systems remained low paid despite being deemed critical. Gig economy expanded in food delivery, eliminating benefits and job security. Meatpacking workers forced into unsafe conditions. Just to highlight that, we have, there were children working in, or teenagers working in these meatpacking plants, I believe getting injured. If I recall right, I think one even passed away. I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, highlighting how disposable labor is treated. Financial extraction. Private equity buying up farmland, housing, healthcare, all basic needs turned into financial instruments. Rent and food costs rising faster than wages as speculation increases. Going back to the chart. Government bailouts flowed to corporations while eviction moratoriums, I hate words, anyway, expired. Yeah, again, class war right there. That was egregious. And we're just expected to accept that. It's ridiculous. Like, the only reason that people are not subject to those conditions is arbitrarily because they were born into a different family. It's literally just a matter of privilege and like a hierarchical society, right? Like, people were essentially just fucked just because of the nature of the life they were born into that they had no control over. Again, the definition of injustice. That happens domestically, it damn sure happens all over the global south. This system, irredeemable, should be abolished, needs to be replaced. Like, cut and dry. Again, because that doesn't even consider the climate stuff. Like, all that stuff is happening, and the climate is getting completely fucked. So it's like, all right, guys, like people are suffering. Suffering is guaranteed to increase. And also, civilization is on track to not be able to function as it currently does as soon as 2100. And that's, I think that's a conservative estimate. If you go off of what the American Petroleum Institute predicted in 1981, they said it could be as soon as 2060, which sounds a bit more on the money based on what the current trends seem to be. And, that's like for the globe. It doesn't account for nations now that are already, breaking, like having to evacuate, having to really put up with some difficult stuff. Again, my wife's hometown, Acapulco, it's been very difficult there since these hurricanes that have only happened because the ocean is as hot as it is. The storms develop so quick and so strong because of the surface temperature, or the temperature of the sea. Anyway, moving on. This section is titled "The Systemic Logic." Competition requires cost cutting. In a profit-driven system, every input, wages, food quality, safety standards, become a cost to minimize. Should be noted here also the tendency of rate of profitability to fall is part of that A to Z understanding I was talking about earlier when it comes to understanding the system. The reason that these companies always seem to stoop to more and more unscrupulous tactics is because of that. It becomes a cost to minimize, but the rate of profit is always falling. So wages, quality, safety standards are always concessions that our class of regular working people have to make for the ruling class to continue to get more and more money and power. And again, they have the ability to influence our laws. So of course, they're going to engineer that in their favor, and we are going to be just missing out on these things. That's why so many of us are paycheck to paycheck and don't have access to these basic necessities. Anyway, companies that don't extract maximum value get outcompeted by those that do. This creates a structural pressure toward the lowest common denominator. Externalization of true costs. Environmental damage, worker health, community stability treated as externalities by the market. Again, cut and dry. What the fuck? Profits privatize while social costs like diabetes, pollution, inequality are socialized. Short-term gains prioritized over long-term stability. Political economy feedback loop. Also, I guess before I go into that, the short-term gains prioritized over long-term stability, again, woven into this system because of the tendency of rate of profit to fall. You know, it's always, they're struggling to stay afloat as a class, the ruling class, and because of that, they have to keep demanding more and more concessions from us. It's a race to the bottom. It's long-term sustainability is not even a part of the discussion. It's accepted that we just have to forfeit our health and our lives and our environment because 10% of the population wants to be wealthy beyond obscenity. It's a foolish system. It would be a shame for the legacy of humanity to come to this point where just because of the system, it's allowed that so much suffering and so much stuff happens, right? It's already irredeemable, right? Like looking at Gaza alone, how can you defend it? But I mean, and then you can connect that with the history of the global south in general and just what's going on around us with our neighbors and what has always, been going on in that regard with people who just don't have resources in this country or who weren't part of the in groups throughout its history. It's voting's not going to fix it. Anyway, political economy feedback loop. Wealth concentration creates political power to maintain these arrangements. Regulatory capture ensures solutions serve capital interest. Working people increasingly lack political voice as economic pressure intensifies. And yeah, there's plenty of studies about this. I wish I had one open. It's especially interesting looking at how different generations have a political voice, because as the older people consolidate more and more among the class of owners, younger workers have less and less, right? And we have less and less representation politically. It's pretty ridiculous. Anyway, considering we're the people who have to live with the consequences of these policy choices. Anyway, goes on to say the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed. The question becomes whether democratic institutions can reassert control over economic ones or if we're locked into this trajectory until it becomes unsustainable. And again, it already is. There's already people who are dying in the street in this nation, people who go without health care, basic necessities, food, shelter. Across the global south, it's unsustainable. We have climate disruption. We have war. We have genocide. What the hell? Anyway, so I asked it, based on our discussion so far, consider outcomes for the future of regular working class families if this system continues as it has been. It says, based on the trajectory we've outlined, the prospects for working families under a continuation of current trends are quite grim. Economic trajectory. Basic needs as investment vehicles. Housing, food, healthcare, education increasingly treated as profit centers rather than human rights. Working families priced out of essentials as private equity and speculation drive up costs. Debt becomes the primary way families access basic needs, creating permanent indebtedness. Labor degradation. Most jobs become gig work with no benefits, security, or living wages. AI and automation eliminates middle-income positions while leaving low-wage service work. Workers compete globally in a race to accept worse conditions. Social breakdown. That's a great title. Community dissolution. Geographic mobility forced by economic necessity breaks social bonds. Public spaces privatized or eliminated, reducing shared civic life. Social solidarity eroded as families struggle individually for survival. I've seen that in our communities now. Intergenerational decline. Each generation inherits more debt, fewer assets, worse environmental conditions. Social mobility becomes largely impossible without existing wealth. Children's outcomes increasingly determined by family financial resources. Again, is that not unjust? Like, what are we doing? Political consequences. Democratic erosion. Wealth concentration leads to complete policy capture. Working families lose any meaningful political voice. You could argue we already have. Authoritarian solutions become appealing as liberal democracy fails to address material needs. Wonder about that. Social control, surveillance, and policing expand. Also, I did want to make a point too. I think it's people that advocate for this kind of thing, like with demagogues and stuff, it's almost not even their fault, because the media is controlled by those very same people with consolidated wealth who benefit from that policy. They're being manipulated, right? They're using their money to manipulate our neighbors into, causing harm to themselves and others. It's a sad thing. It's class war. Anyway, I just don't like how it kind of blames that these things become appealing, like it's an organic thing and not shaped, again, with policy. Social control, surveillance, and policing expand to manage inequality and desperation. Scapegoating and division used to prevent working class solidarity. Wonder when that's happened throughout history. Basic dissent, criminalized as economic pressure, creates social instability. The end state, essentially a return to feudalism, a small class of capital owners and a large class of permanent debtors and renters with no assets, security, or political power. The current trajectory suggests working families becoming completely dependent on systems they have no control over. This isn't speculation, it is the logical endpoint of trends already well underway. How interesting. So here we finally get to the point where, what can we do about it? How can the trends be disrupted or addressed by regular working people? Giving the systemic analysis we've developed, meaningful change requires strategies that build collective power to challenge these structures directly. Economic power building, cooperative economics, worker cooperatives that keep ownership and profits in the community, community land trusts to remove land from speculation, credit unions and mutual aid networks to create alternative financial systems, community-supported agriculture and local food networks, labor organization, workplace organizing across traditional union boundaries, solidarity strikes that connect workers across industries, tenant unions to collectively bargain with landlords, cross-border labor solidarity to prevent race-to-the-bottom dynamics. Huge. Political strategy. Electoral politics. So I know I've been disparaging voting, but it's part of the arsenal. It's just not all we can rely on. It's insufficient. But yeah, run working class candidates who refuse corporate money. Support policies like public banking, social housing, universal health care, municipal socialism, taking control of local utilities, services, land use. Almost a no-brainer. Direct action. Mass noncompliance with evictions and foreclosures. Blockades of land grabs and environmental destruction. Strategic disruption of key economic choke points, be it ports or logistics. We're getting into illegal territory, so interesting that it makes that suggestion. But I mean, again, that's what we did in the 30s. Anyway, ideological cultural work, education and consciousness, popular education about how these systems actually work. Check out Triangle Free Press. Media that serves working class interests rather than capital. Cultural work that rebuilds solidarity and collective identity. Key principles. Think systematically. Target the structures, not just the symptoms. Build alternatives while fighting existing systems. That's what I'm never shutting the fuck up about, building dual power. Please do, if you haven't, check out the Black Socialists in America's website. They have some very great material on building dual power, and if you want to see what that looks like in practice, you can look at Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, just for inspiration. That can scale to our communities. We can do this. Anyway, Connect local struggles to broader movements. And build real power. Focus on strategies that force concessions, not just moral appeals. Create organizations that can sustain long-term struggle. Develop capacity for both resistance and governance. The window for reform may be closing. These trends suggest more fundamental transformation will be necessary. What resonates most? Oh, it's asking me stuff. But yeah, I just thought that was a very interesting response from this thing. And then I said, what are some similar instances throughout history that we can look toward for insight in addressing and changing the status quo based on the above? It goes on to talk about the Long Depression from the 1870s to the 1890s. Farmers and workers built cooperative alternatives like the Grange movement, cooperative stores, credit unions. They created independent political parties that force major policy changes. Imagine that, demanding policy change. Successfully pushed for public ownership of railroads and utilities in many areas. Demonstrated how economic organizing can translate into political power. So, like, again, this is part of our history. We solved problems with, arguably socialist policy and demanded it and organized for it plenty of times. Labor organizing. Great segue. 8-hour workday won through sustained strikes and organizing. Industrial unionism emerged to counter corporate consolidation. International solidarity prevented employers from using immigrant workers as strikebreakers. Here's my favorite, the Great Depression. Sit-down strikes. Workers physically occupied factories, making production impossible. Forced recognition of industrial unions and collective bargaining. Demonstrated that strategic disruption of key economic choke points works. Cooperative movement. Thousands of worker and consumer cooperatives created alternative economic structures. Rural electrification cooperatives brought power to areas corporations ignored. Credit union movement provided community-controlled banking. The next section, very fun one, very relevant for our current struggles. Decolonization movements. Land reform campaigns. Successful redistribution of concentrated land ownership in Mexico, Cuba, various African countries. It showed us how political organization can restructure economic relations. Demonstrated importance of controlling key resources. Two ones that are rent-free in my mind are Algeria and Vietnam, how they were able to nationalize industries, which, considering when we have privately owned industries and they are using their ill-gotten gains to influence policy and make life harder for regular working people at home and abroad, why not encourage policy that would result in them being nationalized so that their infrastructure can be used for something good? Something to organize around, Anyway, they also did import substitution. Countries developed domestic industries to reduce dependence on colonial trade patterns and created space for national economic development outside of global extraction systems. Something that we're just starting to do here in this country, honestly. Again, that's, even if it's just making intentional choices about where we're spending our money right now, if it's outside of global extraction systems, that's a huge one, right? Nordic social democracy. Class compromise, which also, they got that because of their proximity to the USSR and they demanded better, right? Class compromise strategy. Strong labor movements forced capital to accept higher wages and social benefits. Public ownership of key sectors like banking, utilities, and natural resources. Again, duh, no brainer. Universal social programs decommodified basic needs. Oh, could you imagine? Key strategic insights. Here it is talking about dual power. Build alternative institutions while challenging existing ones. Create parallel economic structures that serve working class needs. Develop capacity for both resistance and governance. Coalition building. Unite different segments of working people around shared interests. Connect urban and rural struggles. Build international solidarity to counter global capital mobility. strategic leverage, target critical economic choke points, transportation, energy, finance, use collective action to make current arrangements unsustainable. Which, need I remind you, the United States was worried about that. Our government was worried about that with regard to Palestine. They really thought people were going to, it was going to be such a movement that their current actions in Israel would become untenable. I remember reading it, I believe in November, 1 month after October 7th. We, regular working people pretty much failed to really organize and challenge that. But that's the thing, is every day is a new opportunity to get that right and to do the right thing for the people of our class, our neighbors here at home and abroad. It should be easy to advocate that, people's children shouldn't be starving. Which is why I wanted to talk about all this stuff in general, because that's just an easy starting point. Just like with the climate, we should have a livable biosphere. We should not be fucking around with that. No matter who you are, that's good for you. Just like having food. These institutions and these structures get in the way of that, of having food. It's like we really need to have a reckoning and look at how we are navigating our lives and how we've been conditioned to navigate our lives and break that conditioning by the status quo. Because it's unhealthy, right? It's unhealthy for us. It's unhealthy for our future, our kids, not to mention the global south, not to mention the environment. Anyway, the last point is force ruling classes to negotiate rather than just resist. The common thread: successful movements combined immediate material improvements with longer-term visions of systemic change. Pretty cool. There was something I was reading earlier, and I was thinking I should ask it another question, but it's slipping my mind now. I've yapped too long. Oh well, I should have wrote it down, but whatever. Well, anyway, that's my 2 cents for today. Thanks for checking this out. As always, if you want to talk about doing the internal work or the external work, internal work being just grappling with this stuff, and external being, building the things that it's talking about here with regard to dual Bauer and just exploring that stuff, maybe in your workplace or communities. Please do get in touch with me. I would love to, it's a lot of this is networking, right? Seeing who can do what, where. And like I was saying, we all have a role. This impacts all of us. We all participate in it. We all need to rectify it. We have a responsibility to understand completely what this status quo means and what it means when we participate in it. And if we agree with that, if we believe the consequences are truly worth it, and why, right? Anyway, yeah, thanks, and y'all take care. Best wishes.